February 13th, 2022, Inglewood, California. A stage shaped like a city block has been assembled at midfield inside SoFi Stadium, and at the center of it, behind a mixing console, is a 56-year-old man in black with his head down and his hands moving. Around him, Snoop Dogg, Mary J. Blige, Kendrick Lamar, 50 Cent hanging upside down, Eminem on one knee. More than 100 million people are watching. The set is a scale replica of Compton, California, built a few miles from the real thing. And the man conducting it grew up inside the real thing with no money, no connections, and nothing resembling a plan beyond a turntable. 13 months before this, he was in intensive care at Cedars-Sinai. He had suffered a brain aneurysm, and then, over about 2 weeks, 3 strokes. He later said his family was allowed up to see him during a COVID lockdown, and that he only understood afterward why the hospital had made the exception. They were there to say goodbye. Andre Romelle Young. Dr. Dre. He is one of the most influential figures in American music, and he was rarely the loudest person in any room he worked in. He built 4 separate empires and walked away from most of them, sometimes with nothing. He signed a rapper from Detroit his own colleagues warned him about, and a rapper from Queens a major label had already dropped. The biggest turning points of his career tend to show up right after something that looked at the time like the end of it. The interesting question about him isn't how he got successful. Plenty of people got successful. It's how a man kept losing or abandoning whatever he had just built across 35 years and came back larger each time. He was born on February 18, 1965, in Compton, to a teenage mother named Verna and a father named Theodore who sang in an R&B group. The middle name, Romelle, came from that group. 6 months later, Watts burned. Los Angeles County was deindustrializing and the plants that had drawn black families west were closing. Compton had been a white suburb that fought to stay white, then flipped almost entirely inside a decade, and the tax base left with the people who could afford to leave. By the time Andre Young was a teenager, unemployment on his block was catastrophic, and crack was about to arrive. His parents separated when he was small. The family moved constantly, in and out of Compton, through Carson and Long Beach, chasing cheaper rent or getting off a street that had turned. In her memoir, Verna Griffin describes a house where music never stopped. She was young, she loved to dance, she had a serious record collection, and she threw parties. Her son was under the speakers. His origin story is less about hardship producing rage and more about a kid who found the one thing he was good at in a place that offered very few, then organized his life around it. By most accounts, he wasn't a fighter or a hustler. He was the guy with the equipment. He was also drifting academically. His mother has written that he had ambitions toward drafting and design, and that his attendance closed that door. The obsession with getting a thing exactly right was already there, before there was any music career to attach it to. It just found a different surface. Then he found the club. Eve After Dark sat in Compton and was run by Alonzo Williams, who also ran a mobile DJ crew. Dre started coming in, then started playing, and in a back room there was a 4-track recorder he began to use. He learned to produce in a club at 2 in the morning, working out what makes a room move, which is a different education from learning it in a studio. The crew became the world-class Wreckin crew. Williams, Dre, and a DJ named Antoine Carabee, who called himself DJ Yeller. Later fans found the next part impossible to believe. They wore sequins, lace, satin, eyeliner. There are photographs, and they have followed Dre for 40 years. He wore a doctor's coat and a stethoscope, because the name was a joke about surgical precision on the turntables. The music was electro, built from drum machines and vocoders, with Kraftwerk and Zapp and Prince running through it. Their biggest local record, Turn Off the Lights, was a slow synth ballad featuring a singer named Michel'le, aimed at radio and at women dancing. The man who became the sound of gangster rap started out making pop. At 20, he wasn't trying to document the street. He was trying to get a hit. He was also broke on a deal that paid almost nothing for records that were locally enormous, and he was arrested more than once over unpaid traffic tickets. The accounts of one of those stretches diverge. Alonzo Williams has said he refused to post bail and that a young man from the neighborhood did it instead. Others tell it differently. Everyone agrees on the outcome, which is that Dre ended up owing a favor to a short, high-voiced, extremely sharp kid named Eric Wright. Wright had sold drugs. He had also saved money, which is rarer, and he wanted to put it into a record label. He called it Ruthless. He called himself Eazy-E. The two of them had a song written by a teenager from South Central named O'Shea Jackson, who rapped as Ice Cube and intended for a group from New York. That group heard the lyrics, heard the accent they were being asked to perform, and refused. Eazy, who was not a rapper, did it himself, in a thin, nasal voice no vocal coach would have recommended, and which turned out to be magnetic. The song was Boys in the Hood, and it started selling out of car trunks. That reorganized things for Dre. He had spent years polishing a sound designed to be palatable, and a record made cheaply in local slang with an untrained voice on it outsold all of it. The lesson he took was a commercial one. The thing that sounds too local to travel is sometimes the only thing that travels. He left the Wreckin crew and took DJ Yella with him. N.W.A. came together in 1987. Eazy-E, Dre, Ice Cube, Yella, MC Ren, and, early on, a producer and rapper named Arabian Prince, whose electro-funk fingerprints are all over the first album, and who gets written out of the story almost entirely. He left before the group broke nationally and was still inducted with them into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame decades later. The business structure explains the next 10 years. Eazy owned Ruthless. Ruthless signed the artists. In 1987, Eazy brought in a veteran manager named Jerry Heller, who had booked Elton John in an earlier life. And Heller and Eazy became partners. The other 5 had contracts. That asymmetry sat under everything that happened afterward. Straight Outta Compton arrived in August of 1988 and sold in the millions, with essentially no radio play and no video rotation. Dre had thrown out the satin. The drums got harder and drier. The samples came from Funkadelic and the Ohio Players and old funk breaks, stacked with a density that made the records feel physically heavier than anything around them. Every member of the group has told a version of the same story about him in the studio. He would run a vocal take dozens of times over a single syllable. Then there was the third track. F the Police was structured as a mock trial, with the group prosecuting the Los Angeles Police Department. It arrived 3 years before the Rodney King video, in a city where the LAPD under Daryl Gates had normalized battering ram raids and mass gang sweeps, and it said, out loud, what a generation of young black men in Los Angeles had been saying privately. In August of 1989, an assistant director at the FBI named Milt Alaric sent a letter to the group's distributor, conveying the Bureau's displeasure. Police departments circulated warnings. Venues cancelled. The group was told not to perform the song, and when they did it in Detroit, officers rushed the stage. All of it worked as promotion. A teenager in suburban Ohio who had never heard of Compton now knew exactly which album the FBI didn't like. The man who made the sound wasn't giving interviews about revolution. Dre has been consistent for 35 years. He was making music he thought sounded good, and he understood the commercial value of shock. He was the quiet one, on a record that frightened the country. Then the money. Ice Cube had written a substantial share of Straight Outta Compton, including verses for other members. When the accounting came, he didn't believe the numbers matched the work, refused to sign a new contract, and left in December of 1989. He went to New York, recorded with Public Enemy's production team, and came back with an album that functioned as an argument. N.W.A. answered on record. Cube answered that with no Vaseline. And part of why it landed is that it aimed at the group's business structure instead of their toughness. Dre watched all of it from inside, and by his own later account, he was in a version of the same position. In interviews in the mid-90s, he put his royalty on the N.W.A. material at around 2%. More recently, he has said he simply didn't grasp then what his own talent was worth in ownership terms. Everything he does for the next 30 years comes out of learning, at 25. That being the most important person in a room is not the same as owning any part of it. Two other things happened in this stretch that usually get skipped. His younger brother Tyree died in 1989 at 21 after a fight. And that November, the DOC, a Texas rapper Dre had brought to Ruthless and produced, released a debut that stood beside anything in the genre. Months later, he fell asleep at the wheel, went through a windshield, and permanently destroyed his larynx. He never got his voice back. He kept writing, and he wrote for Dre for years afterward. If you want to understand why Dre trusted so few people and kept the same collaborators for decades, that friendship is much of the answer. On January 27, 1991, at a record release party in Los Angeles, Dre assaulted a journalist named Dee Barnes. Barnes hosted a hip-hop television program and had aired a segment the group felt favored Ice Cube. She pressed charges. Dre pleaded no contest to misdemeanor battery, received probation, a fine and community service, and settled her civil suit out of court. Barnes has written that the physical and professional damage lasted years, and that her career in the industry never recovered. At the time, members of the group joked about the incident in interviews. That is documented. It was treated publicly as content. Michel'le, the singer from the Wreckin crew records, was in a relationship with Dre for years and had a child with him. She has stated in multiple interviews and in a 2016 television film that he was violently abusive throughout and has described specific injuries. Dre has never contested her account in detail. There were other documented incidents in this period, including a battery conviction involving a record producer. These facts and the musical achievements occupy the same years and the same man, and there is no way to weigh them against each other, because they don't cancel. What Dre eventually said about it, more than 20 years later, comes near the end of this story, along with the fact that the responses were not unanimous. By 1991, he wanted out of Ruthless. He had met Marion Knight, called Suge, a former college football player working in music security and publishing, who had a talent for identifying leverage and a physical presence that made conversations go a particular way. Suge began representing Dre's interest in getting released from his contract. What happened next is one of the most repeated stories in hip-hop, and it needs care. Eazy-E stated in interviews that he was intimidated into signing release papers and described a meeting involving threats. Suge Knight denied that account for years. Nobody was ever criminally convicted over it. Ruthless sued and the matter settled, with Ruthless keeping a financial interest in Dre's next work. What can be said accurately is this: Dre got out. Eazy said he was coerced. Suge said otherwise. And no court ever resolved it. The new label was Death Row Records, and its funding has been disputed for 30 years. Michael Harris, a convicted drug trafficker in a California prison, has claimed since the beginning that his money seeded the company. What is undisputed is that in 1992, after other distributors passed, Jimmy Iovine's Interscope Records agreed to distribute Death Row, and Interscope's parent company absorbed the political heat in Washington for the next 4 years. For the first time, Dre was building the room instead of working in it. The Chronic came out on December 15, 1992, and moved the commercial center of American music. The dense, sample-stacked wall of N.W.A. was gone. In its place, live bass played by Colin Wolfe, high whining synthesizer lines, slow tempos, enormous space in the mix, and the melodic DNA of 70s funk, particularly Parliament and Funkadelic, and the talkbox world of Roger Troutman. Instead of chopping a sample into fragments, Dre had musicians replay the idea, which gave him control of the arrangement and changed the clearance economics. It sounded like a summer afternoon in a convertible, while describing things that were not remotely relaxing. And that contradiction is most of why it worked. G-Funk made hard content go down like pop, which meant it went everywhere, including into houses where the parents had no idea what was playing. It also introduced a 19-year-old from Long Beach with a voice like Slow Smoke, Calvin Broadus, Snoop Doggy Dogg. He was the first demonstration of what turned out to be Dre's most valuable skill. He didn't look for someone who sounded like him. He looked for a voice occupying a frequency range and a rhythmic pocket nobody else was using, then built an entire world around it. Snoop's debut, Doggy Style, arrived in November of 1993 and entered the Billboard chart at number 1, the first debut album ever to do that. By the mid-90s, Death Row was reportedly generating over $100 million a year, and Dre owned half of it. He was 30 years old and had, on paper, everything he had wanted since Compton. The trouble was what running it came to mean. Artists, engineers, and employees have all described an atmosphere at the label's studios that made ordinary work difficult. There were people in the building with no clear function. There were incidents. Sessions were interrupted by things that had nothing to do with music. Suge Knight's methods, later documented across multiple criminal proceedings, were not a rumor. For a man whose defining trait was wanting a hi-hat moved 4 milliseconds, this was intolerable in a specific way. Fear was part of it. The larger part was that he could no longer do the thing he was best at, and he has said in different decades that he stopped enjoying the studio. In October of 1995, Suge Knight posted the bond that got Tupac Shakur out of a New York prison, and Tupac signed to Death Row. It produced extraordinary music, including California Love, which Dre produced. It also poured accelerant on an East Coast and West Coast antagonism the national press was already covering like a sport. Dre was by then the most conspicuously out-of-place person at his own company. He didn't want the feud or the entourage. Suge took public shots at his absence, including from a stage at an awards show. In March of 1996, Dre left. He did not negotiate a payout. He signed away his 50% and disclaimed his ownership of the masters he had made there, including The Chronic. He kept a royalty arrangement on paper that he would spend the next 15 years suing to collect on, with mixed results. Estimates of what he surrendered run into the tens of millions, and none of those figures come from a confirmed accounting. He walked out of the most profitable label in music, at its peak, owning nothing of it. In the spring of 1996, that looked like the end of Dr. Dre. 6 months later, it looked like something else. On September 7, 1996, Tupac Shakur was shot in Las Vegas and died 6 days after. Suge Knight, driving the car, was returned to prison on a probation violation. The artists began leaving, and by 2006, the label that had defined an era was in bankruptcy. So the timing was either extraordinary judgment or extraordinary luck, and it was probably both. Dre had been trying to leave for over a year. He didn't know what was coming. He knew the place had become incompatible with the work, and he was willing to pay enormously to get out. That willingness comes up again. His new label was Aftermath Entertainment, funded and distributed through Interscope, which meant his relationship with Jimmy Iovine survived the divorce from Suge. The first release, in November of 1996, was a compilation whose lead single, Been There, Done That, amounted to a public resignation letter from gangsta rap. Tuxedos in the video. Dre in a mansion. The people who had bought The Chronic 4 years earlier were not interested in Dre in a tuxedo telling them he had moved on. Then came The Firm, a 1997 supergroup album with Nas, Foxy Brown, and AZ that Dre executive produced. It debuted at #1, it went platinum, and it is remembered as a failure anyway, because expectations were astronomical and the reviews were savage. By 1998, the industry conversation about Dr. Dre had a settled, respectful, past tense quality. He was 33, running a label with no stars, 6 years removed from anything that mattered. In an art form built on youth, that's a eulogy. Aftermath was, by several accounts, close to being shut down. In 1997, a competition called the Rap Olympics was held in Los Angeles. A 24-year-old from Detroit named Michel'le Mathers, recently evicted, drove out with almost nothing, entered, and came second. He was reportedly furious because he needed the prize money. At least 2 Interscope staffers were in that room and took his demo. And which of them deserves the credit is still disputed. The tape reached Jimmy Iovine, who has said he was persuaded partly by the young man who brought it. Dre's account has stayed identical for 25 years. In his entire career, he had never found anything from a demo tape. And when Iovine played this one, he said, "Find him. Now." The mythology says Dre discovered Eminem. He didn't do it alone. He heard him because a man he trusted put a disc in a player. And the most consequential act of talent recognition in his life was collaborative. He has never claimed otherwise. 2 things get flattened by hindsight. Dre didn't know Eminem was white. He heard a voice, a set of rhythms, and a sense of humor that was genuinely disturbing, and he wanted it before he knew there was a marketing problem. And when he found out, people around him told him not to do it. Hip-hop in 1998 had a fresh memory of a white rapper turned into a punchline, and the risk was reputational. Dre was the most credible producer alive, and this could have ended that. His response, as he has recounted it, was that he didn't care what color the man was, if he could rap. It works better as a business philosophy than a moral position, and it explains most of the second act. His advantage was never taste in the ordinary sense. It was a willingness to be first, in public, on something other people found embarrassing. They met at Iovine's office and were recording within hours. Dre has described sitting at a drum machine, hitting play on a loop he had ready, and Eminem immediately delivering the opening line of what became My Name Is. The Slim Shady LP arrived in February of 1999 and sold in the millions. The Michel'le Mathers LP the following year moved more than 1.5 million copies in a week in the United States alone. Aftermath was not closing. In November of 1999, Dre released 2001, his first solo album in 7 years. It sold over 500,000 in a week, and produced the songs that still open his catalog for most listeners. This is also where the biggest misconception about him needs correcting. Dr. Dre does not write his raps and has never seriously pretended to. Still, Dre, the song that reintroduced him as untouchable, was written by Jay-Z. Across his career, his verses have been written or co-written by the DOC, Snoop, Eminem, Royce da 5'9", Rakim, and Kendrick Lamar. The music works the same way. Michel'le co-produced most of 2001. Scott Storch played keyboards on much of it, and Kamara Kambon played the piano figure on Still Dre. Later rooms included Mike Elizondo, Mark Batts, and DeWaun Parker, plus the engineers who translated his EAR into settings on a console. Some people treat that as a scandal. It's closer to a job description. Dre is a director. He assembles the best people available, sets an impossible standard, and refuses to release anything until the room reaches it. Knowing precisely what you want and recognizing it instantly when someone else produces it is rarer than being able to play the part yourself. The record has one author, because one person made every final decision. The standard was punishing. Musicians describe 16-hour days, hundreds of takes, weeks on a single drum sound. The surgical clarity of 2001 is the product of an absurd amount of repetition. That perfectionism paid for 20 years, and it also cost him an album. In 2002, Eminem brought him a rapper from Queens, Curtis Jackson, 50 Cent. He had been shot 9 times in 2000, dropped by his label, and had spent 2 years building an audience on mixtapes because no major would touch him. Dre and Eminem signed him jointly. Get Rich or Die Tryin' arrived in February of 2003 and sold over 800,000 copies in 4 days. That's when the arithmetic changed. Dre was no longer a producer with a hot artist. He was the center of a system, Interscope on top, Aftermath and Shady beneath it, G-Unit beneath that, talent moving up and distribution moving down. He took production fees, executive producer points, and equity in other people's success. He had turned the lesson of N.W.A. into an operating structure. He also reportedly sold a share of Aftermath back to Interscope around then, for a figure Forbes has placed near $35 million. Over the following decade, he executive produced the game's debut, worked with Eminem through his worst and biggest years, and signed Kendrick Lamar to the deal that put Good Kid, M.A.A.D. City into the world in 2012. In all that time, he did not release his own album. Detox was announced around 2001 and discussed for 14 years. Singles were released and withdrawn. Dates were set and abandoned. It became the most famous unfinished object in the genre, a running joke that stopped being funny. The simplest explanation is the true one, and Dre has essentially confirmed it. He didn't think it was good enough. He has said he has hundreds of finished songs in a vault and doesn't know whether anyone will hear them. The trait that made 2001 sound the way it does is the trait that prevented Detox from existing. Perfectionism is just a mechanism, and what it produces depends on what is constraining it. With a deadline and someone else's career at stake, it made masterpieces. With unlimited time and only his own legacy to protect, it made silence. Around 2006, Irvine and Dre started talking about headphones. The story both men tell begins with a different frustration. Artists were being asked to endorse sneakers, while cheap earbuds and digital compression destroyed the fidelity of music that had cost fortunes to make. Dre had spent 30 years on the exact placement of a bass frequency, and listeners were hearing none of it. The proposal was that they sell speakers instead of shoes. In 2006, this was a bad idea. Consumer audio was a mature, low-margin business owned by Sony and Bose. Celebrity electronics were a graveyard. Nobody had ever sold a $200 accessory to teenagers on the argument that it sounded better. Beats by Dr. Dre launched in 2008 through a manufacturing partnership with Monster Cable. The products were heavy, glossy, bass-forward, and available in colors. Audiophiles objected. And they were technically correct and entirely beside the point, because Beats was selling fashion that happened to be audio equipment. They barely advertised. They placed headphones on athletes walking into stadiums, on artists in videos, on the necks of the people who already defined what cool meant. By 2011, Beats held well over half the premium headphone market in the United States. That year, they sold a controlling stake to the Taiwanese phone manufacturer HTC for around $300 million, then bought most of it back within about a year, having kept the cash and the company. Monster's founder, Noel Lee, has said publicly that he was maneuvered out in 2012. In January of 2014, Beats launched a subscription streaming service, and that is the move that mattered. Because Apple had a streaming problem. In May of 2014, Apple agreed to acquire Beats for $3 billion, roughly $2.6 billion of it in cash, the largest acquisition in the company's history to that point. Irvine and Dre both went to Apple, and the service was rebuilt into Apple Music. Before the deal closed, a video appeared online of Dre celebrating with the actor Tyrese Gibson and announcing himself as the first billionaire in hip-hop. Apple, a company that does not enjoy surprises, was reportedly unamused. The deal closed anyway. And he wasn't a billionaire. Taxes, the split with Irvine, and the structure of the payout put the real figure considerably lower. Something else in that transaction gets lost behind the headphones. Dre made more in one afternoon than the entire recorded music business had ever paid him. 30 years of platinum albums, of inventing a genre, of building 3 of the biggest artists alive. All of it had generated less personal wealth than a consumer electronics brand he ran for 8 years. That's a structural fact about who captures value in music. And Dre learned it the hard way, one contract at a time. He and Irvine had already given $70 million to the University of Southern California in 2013 to found an academy combining business, technology, and design, and he later directed proceeds from his 2015 album Compton toward a performing arts center in the city he came from. That album is what Detox became. He made it in weeks, timed to the film Straight Outta Compton, then said publicly that Detox was never coming because it hadn't been good enough. 14 years of the most anticipated record in hip-hop, resolved by a man admitting the work wasn't there. The film was a commercial triumph, and a curated one. Dre and Ice Cube produced it. It did not include the assault on Dee Barnes. Barnes wrote about the omission publicly, and the conversation that followed forced a reckoning the industry had spent 25 years avoiding. In August of 2015, Dre issued a statement to the New York Times. He said he had been a young man drinking too much, with no structure in his life, that none of it excused what he did, and that he apologized to the women he had hurt. He said he deeply regretted it. The responses were not the same. Dee Barnes accepted it, writing that the reasons behind it mattered less than the fact that he had finally taken public accountability. Michel'le did not. She told the BBC she had never asked for a public apology, that if he was going to apologize, he should do it individually, and that grouping the women together didn't feel sincere. "Treat us like we have names," she said. Both responses are legitimate, and they don't need to be reconciled. Since then, A divorce filed in 2020 and settled in 2021 reported to have cost him around $100 million. The aneurysm and the 3 strokes. The Super Bowl 13 months later, which won an Emmy. A spirits company with Snoop Dogg. And Missionary in December of 2024. A full album he produced for Snoop, 31 years after Doggy Style. Then, in March of 2026, Forbes placed Dr. Dre on its Billionaires list for the first time, at an estimated $1 billion, ranked 3,332nd in the world. 12 years after he announced it in a leaked video, the number was finally real. Back to the question then, how does a man lose or abandon everything he builds repeatedly and end up larger every time? There's no single answer, and the ones usually on offer are too tidy. What there is instead is a handful of traits that only do anything in combination. He had an ear that identified value before the market could. Eazy-E's untrained voice, Snoop's cadence, a white rapper from Detroit, a rapper 9 bullets and 1 dropped contract into his career. Those weren't safe bets. They were correct ones, made early in public, before the evidence existed. The standard he wouldn't lower built the catalog and also swallowed Detox whole. And he would walk away from things that were still working, which almost nobody does. The Wreckin crew while the satin was still selling. Ruthless at the peak of N.W.A. Death Row at 31. Half of the most profitable label in music, signed away for nothing. He also knew he was not a solo act. Every era has another name attached to it. Eazy, Suge, Snoop, Iovine, Eminem. He directed the room, without ever mistaking himself for it. Then the expensive one, the one that took him 30 years. The difference between being paid and owning something. 2% on N.W.A, nothing on Death Row's masters. 35 million for a slice of Aftermath. 3 billion for a headphone company. Each stage handed him something the previous one couldn't. Technical skill, then cultural authority, then control over talent, then equity. None of that makes him a hero. He assaulted a journalist and beat a woman he lived with for years. It took him 25 years and a movie premiere to say anything about it. And one of those women still doesn't believe him. Those facts sit permanently beside the rest, and they don't dissolve because the records were good. What's true about him is stranger than either version people usually want. He is one of the most consequential musical figures of the last half-century, and one of its most documented abusers. He is a private man who spent his life building public monuments. He invented the sound of gangster rap, and was, by nearly every account of everyone who worked beside him, the least dangerous person in the room. Most people who build one enormous thing spend the rest of their lives defending it. They stay too long. They mistake the thing for themselves, and when it fails, they fail with it. Dre never did that. The Wreckin crew taught him the craft. N.W.A gave him cultural force. Death Row made him a superstar. Leaving Death Row asked whether he could survive without a machine, and for 2 years the answer looked like no. Eminem changed the answer. 50 Cent turned it into a system, and Beats turned the system into ownership. The continuous thing was never the label, or the album, or the artist, or the company. He built a version of himself, ran it until it stopped serving him, then dismantled it and built another. 5 times over. The man in sequins at Eve After Dark. The producer standing behind Eazy-E. The half-owner of Death Row. The executive with a Detroit rapper nobody wanted. The man at Apple. All of them were Andre Young. And he does not seem to have expected any of them to last.